you and Peter Attia used to have worked closely together. What's something where you disagree, and what's your perspective?
Okay, so Peter and I worked together on this not-for-profit, NUSI, which Peter left in 2016-17, and I eventually shut down in 2021. One of the things we wanted to test, so one of the goals was to raise money to actually do scientific experiments, which are different than diet experiments, to test the hypothesis that fat storage and obesity are caused by the carbohydrate content of the diet working primarily through the hormone insulin, diabetes again, rather than how much you eat and exercise, the conventional calories in, calories out model. We funded 2 studies that tested that hypothesis directly. They were interpreted in antipodal ways. One was interpreted as confirming this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, and one was interpreted as confirming the energy balance model of obesity. And my takeaway was that when you fund experiments, when you do experiments that have never been done before, you learn how you screwed up the experiment more than anything else. In an ideal world, we'd have raised more money to do better experiments based on what we had learned from these first 2, but with Peter leaving and me not willing to put in the time, we never got to that point. In Peter's book, Outlive, and in his practice, he now promotes an energy balance view of obesity and weight loss. So on some level, you get fatter because you eat too much or are physically inactive, and you solve the problem when you lose weight. The only way diets work when they get you to eat less. That's kind of the message he conveys, as I understand it. That was the hypothesis we were testing in the not-for-profit. I find it naive. Biologically, physiologically, endocrinology, I'm kind of stunned that Peter no longer does, that he's willing to accept this as an explanation. And at the very least...
His theory is that it's not diet, it's exercise.
No, his theory, diets work, he says, when you eat less. I think that's actually...
So his theory is that it's just purely calories in, calories out.
It's ultimately it's calories.
And so where you differ is you say it's not just calories, it's the content of what you're eating, specifically carbohydrates matter a lot.
And although it's not just that it's not just calories. I don't believe you can understand anything meaningful about obesity as a disease state if you think of it as a calorie in, calorie out problem. It's a description of what happens. Like when Peter says, again, I'm hoping I'm communicating his message correctly, when he says obesity is caused, diets work when you eat less or when you're in negative energy balance, I would say, yeah, of course, if you're losing weight, you're in negative energy balance. The question is, what causes a negative energy balance? That could be a conscious restriction on calories consumed and an increase in energy expenditure, or it can be created by carbohydrate restriction and changing the hormonal environment that the fat cells see. And as we tried to do for 6 years at NUSI, those hypotheses can be tested. Until they are tested, you don't make dogmatic statements. So I'm a little bit mystified by it, but...
What do you think he's overlooking or that he's taking for granted, which he should not be?
The endocrine regulation of fat storage.
Meaning what?
Fat cells don't see how much, and this is, when I have tried to discuss this with Peter, I often use arguments that he himself used back when he believed what I believe. So fat cells don't see how much you're eating and exercising. Fat cells are responding to the hormonal signals that are secreted in response to what you're eating. And to some extent, they see the fat and carbohydrates that are in the circulation, the fatty acids and triglycerides in the circulation, and the level of blood sugar. But then whether or not they will take up that fat and whether or not they will release it is determined hormonally and primarily by the hormone insulin, which is where this carbohydrate insulin model comes from. Peter knows that. He says as much in his book, talks about insulin being a hormone that basically locks fat in fat cells. So that implies that if insulin is elevated, you will be getting fatter. And if you want to get thinner, you have to lower insulin. And that's a response to the carbohydrate content of the diet, not necessarily the calorie content.
I mean, could it be that both things matter, or that it's calories and the content?
I think calories are a valuable way to quantify how much food you're eating or how much of these different macronutrients you're eating. But as soon as you say that obesity is caused by taking in more calories than we expend, which has been the conventional wisdom for 60 years, and it was a competing hypothesis for 50 years before that. As soon as you say that, you've taken a complex physiological and endocrine system. Here's one way to think about it: calories in and calories out. That's what you're eating and what you're expending. In the 20th century, when that idea, late 19th century, early 20th century, when that idea started to get locked in, it was because the only thing nutritionists could measure in the food we consume that could be relevant to obesity was the energy content of the food. And then they had these devices called calorimeters that allowed them to measure how much energy people expended. And so these were the only factors they had. And so they came up with the theory of obesity depending on what they could measure.
But isn't it true, like cheese, for example, has no carbs, right? For the most part.
For the most part.
And if I ate, 15 pounds of cheese every day with 0 carbs, I'd get fat, right? I'd gain a lot.
Right, but that doesn't mean that people who get fat got fat because they ate 15 pounds of food. There's a difference between consciously forcing yourself to get fatter, okay, and people who manifest obesity.
You're saying in reality, the people who end up getting obese, the way you get there, even though you could get there by eating 15 pounds of cheese.
Well, actually, it's not sure. I don't think you could. I bet you personally could do as an experiment. I bet you'd gain around 10 pounds, but you would not become clinically obese. You'd gain some weight. You'd find it very hard to keep it up day in and day out. And after a while, your weight would plateau at maybe 10. I'm speculating, but you would not necessarily become obese and in fact, as I discussed in my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, there were researchers who tried to do these experiments, both on themselves and on others. The most famous example, and this is, by the way, why I recommended we could do this as an entirely different episode of your show. Late 1960s in Vermont, in a state prison, a researcher named Ethan Thims decided he was going to take prisoners and force them to get fat and study how different diets did it. And the first attempt was to do it with an Atkins diet, even though Atkins had published in a magazine but had yet to write his book. And his researchers, I interviewed the ones who were there. Virtually all of them were still alive when I was doing my first book. And they described these prisoners sitting there with plates of pork chops in front of them and refusing to eat them. They couldn't get them to gain weight. So eventually they had to switch to a different method, which was, a baseline diet, which had carbs versus either carb calories or fat calories. And they found out that they described it as heroic to get these people to eat enough fat to get them to gain weight, but eventually they did. And yet they would also say that they could eat 10,000 calories a day of carbohydrates and go to bed hungry. So there's all these interactions between fuel availability in your periphery versus whether or not you're hungry that is actually... It's a very complex story, but let me just guarantee you it is not as simple as you think. And the one thing you can't do is say, if I ate 5,000 calories a day, wouldn't I get fatter? You would. You might even on a ketogenic diet. It's conceivable you might even doing that on a carnivore diet.
But your point is that it's much less likely. It's much less appetizing. Like, you're not going to have 5,000 calories on a ketogenic because it's not as palatable.
The assumption is always that if we see someone with obesity, that's how they got fat. fat. So let me give you another example, which in my book, Why We Get Fat, was maybe the second chapter. Imagine you gain 20 pounds in the next decade. Okay, so right now your BMI, you had told me you're a triathlete, but let's say your BMI is 25. You don't look, what's your height and weight?
I'm 5'8", 170. I'm
Oh,
heavy right
okay,
now.
so you're
Big
probably up around
triathlete.
27.
Hope not, but yeah.
That's all right. I was a football player. I live around 29, 30, and I go through life saying, I'm clinically obese. I look like a linebacker, but technically. Anyway, the point is, let's say you gain 20 pounds in the next 10 years. So that's, now you're 190. Now I'm sure you're over BMI over 30, okay, at 5'8". Could you do it eating cheese? I don't think so, but let's just figure out how many calories you have to store as fat every day to accumulate that 20 pounds. So a pound of fat is around 3,500 calories. So there's 360. So you're gaining 2 pounds a year, and you're storing 2 pounds of fat a year in your fat tissue. Again, I'm simplifying because some of that is going to be lean tissue, which is fewer calories per gram. But let's say it's all fat. 2 pounds a year is 7,000 calories of fat that you're storing every year. You divide that by 365 days in a year. For all intents and purposes, you are storing 20 calories a day as fat that your lean friend who stays lean is not. So that's bless you, that's your positive energy balance. 20 calories a day. Okay? That's 3 almonds. 3 peanuts, 2 gummy bears. It's a bite of food. It's a couple of sips of Coke. So now you have to explain.
On top of the elevated, but your calorie needs go up and up and up as your weight goes up. And so that 3
Yeah,
almonds, the gummy bears that you're saying
this
on
is
top
always
of your elevated.
This is always
calorie.
the excess. This is always the excess.
But to be clear, like, and this is maybe an unnecessary detail, but to be clear, when you say let's stick with the example 3 almonds, you're saying 3 almonds on top of your basal metabolic rate, which is increasing along with your rate.
Absolutely. But the point is, that's what you have to eat less of if you believe that obesity is caused by eating more than you expend. So on any particular day, you're in energy balance, and then you're exceeding the energy balance by 20 calories a day. So in theory, if you eat 20 calories less every day, you won't gain the weight. Or you could even make it more extreme. In theory, if you eat 200 calories less every day, you won't gain the weight. Okay, that's what and again, these numbers, I didn't come up with this. This is the kind of discussion they had 120 years ago in the textbooks. How can obesity be an energy balance disorder if this is the daily increase that people, 2 pounds of fat a year is common?
No, but again, but if I gain 10 more pounds and then all of a sudden my daily caloric intake requirements in order to maintain that weight have now increased by X number of calories.
True.
So the term excess, the
We're
notion
always
of the term,
talking about the excess.
but the notion of the word excess in real numbers, that is 3 almonds plus 10%. So it's like, we're not talking about 30 calories. We're talking about 400 calories plus 3 almonds, and then it's 600 calories plus 3 almonds because we have to account for the amount of caloric. So it's not really fair to say. But the point is, it's not 3 almonds. It's a lot of almonds.
No, we're just talking about the amount of calories stored as fat every day. Your fat tissue is increasing by 20 calories of fat per day. That's what you're trying to stop from happening. That's independent of all that other increase in metabolic thing. I'm just saying every day your fat tissue is storing 20 calories of fat. If you're gaining weight at the rate of 2 pounds a year, some people gain it at 10 pounds a year, then that's going to be 200 calories of fat that's being stored every day. But that's still not a lot considering you're eating 2,000, 3,000 calories a day. Even if the amount that you need to eat to remain in energy balance goes up, you still have to explain why your fat tissue is storing 20 calories a day. You can explain that with an endocrine hypothesis. That's the kind of thing like when you're growing as a child, your lean tissue and your bones, are growing by a similar amount of calories every day. That's all driven by growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor. Another it's a hormonal phenomenon that's causing your body to get bigger. But you cannot explain it by a calories in, calories out issue. And what you'll find is that people don't attempt to. So you have people like me saying, look, I get it. Like Peter, look, I get it. Okay? People lose weight when they eat less. But let's take the period of time when they were gaining weight and ask, why didn't they eat less enough to prevent that weight gain from happening, considering that weight gain is on an order of 20 or 30 or 40 calories per day? How do you explain that without saying, which is how researchers 100 years ago got around this, by saying, well, they just don't have willpower, or they're ignorant, or they don't know enough.
Yeah.
And Peter himself is a prime example, because he talks about gaining 30 pounds of fat while he was working out 3 hours a day. In his book, he talks about his wife asking him if he could be a little, how did she phrase it? A little less not lean, after he's just swum from one island in Hawaii to the other, and he's standing on the beach and he's 30 pounds overweight.
How is he overweight? What was he doing?
He was getting fatter despite working out 3 hours a day.
What was he doing? Eating a lot? What was he?
I think today he would have to say he was eating too much.
Well, I mean, what else would he say? It seems like the only thing.
Get him on your show and ask him.